Thanks, Celia.
Yeah, of course. Awesome. So today I'll be presenting basically what I've been working on for my master's. And now I'm in the process of preparing it for a manuscript. And I did want to thank you all who have been involved for all your help. Um, I'm also mindful of your time, so please let me know whenever I should start wrapping up for you, so you guys have enough time to do the recordings. But I guess, you're probably all very familiar with this, but I want to spend some time introducing executive function, which is the main construct that I analyze in this project. So as you probably know, executive function is a set of mental skills that include working memory, self-control or inhibition, and flexible thinking or shift. And these executive function skills gradually develop, they change across lifespans, and they can also be adversely affected by many factors. So, for example, research has shown that executive function skills are impaired in children with autism in both laboratory settings and then also in daily life activities. So, in the same way, research has shown that executive function can be improved. So, for instance, some research has shown that bilinguals have better executive function skills than monolinguals. So this idea that bilingualism might lead to better executive functions is often referred to as the bilingual advantage. And I do want to say there's a lot of debate about this. So one of the proposed mechanisms of the bilingual advantage is the idea of joint activation, or basically that both languages are always active, meaning there's a constant competition for selection between the languages. So how this works is that the lifelong experience of constantly inhibiting and shifting between the two languages creates more effective mechanisms for executive control. And that it's hypothesized that that is why we see these cognitive benefits in bilinguals, even in tasks that don't involve language at all. So there's been many studies investigating bilingual advantage in typical populations, but there's really no agreement currently. That's why it's such a big debate. So these mixed results still make it very unclear whether or not there is a bilingual advantage for executive function, if it truly exists, and also under what conditions. And it might be that bilingual advantage only manifests under specific circumstances. So Lucine and I previously worked on a review paper together, and we found that despite this disagreement and the mixed results, most research aligns with the view that there's either, first of all, no bilingual advantage, or that it's restricted to specific circumstances or populations. So, for example, we found that the most robust findings of a bilingual advantage come from studies researching populations of older adults experiencing cognitive decline, also populations of lower economic backgrounds, and finally, children on the autism spectrum, which will be the main focus of the study. So you are all probably very familiar with this, but a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is on the basis of difficulties in two areas. So social communication and restricted and repetitive behaviors or interests. And in order to be diagnosed with autism, an individual must have difficulties in both of these areas. So although it's not really a core symptom of autism or a diagnostic criteria, many individuals with autism have difficulty with executive functioning as well. And these executive dysfunctions are proposed to contribute to core features of autism, which I'll be talking a little bit more in more detail in the next slide. So with that said, some characteristic features of autism include difficulty with theory of mind, or perspective taking skills, or essentially the ability to contribute or attribute cognitive states and emotions to oneself and to others. Also difficulties with social communication, or I guess the use of language in social contexts, as well as repetitive behaviors. And as I mentioned before, executive function has been found to play a crucial role for each of these autism-related traits, and there is evidence that children with better executive function skills have fewer of these symptoms. Also, although there are mixed type findings, there is some research supporting the idea that bilingual children have less difficulty with these core autism traits than monolingual children. But the issue with many of these studies is that most of them only look at typically developing children So we don't really know much about the influences of bilingualism across the spectrum. So just to kind of summarize the intro. So overall, previous work has found associations between bilingualism and executive function. Studies have also linked executive function skills with core autism traits. And additionally, some emerging work has suggested associations between bilingualism and the core autism traits. But all of these associations have not been studied together. And not only that, most studies have mainly focused on either typically developing children or children on the spectrum, but really none of them have looked at them together. So really, altogether, these findings raise the question of whether bilingual children with autism can potentially compensate for autism-related restricted repetitive behaviors, empathy, and social communication difficulties, and what role executive function may play in this process. And that's really what I wanted to study for my master's. So the aim of the study was to investigate the potential role of executive function in the relationship between bilingualism and core autism traits. And in order to answer these questions, I had three main goals. So first, it's to investigate if there is an association between bilingualism and everyday executive functions in children with and without autism, right? And again, this is still very debated. And then next is to test if there is an association between bilingualism and the core autism traits. And then finally, we hypothesize that executive function may be a potential mediator between bilingualism and core autism traits. So we're hoping to better understand this relationship. And I do want to mention that this third goal is a little different from the previous goals, and that goals 1 and 2 include diagnosis as a categorical predictor, whereas the third goal, it's looking at continuous variation between these traits. So before I go over the goals in a little bit more detail, I wanted to talk about the study participants. So the participants were recruited back in the day when the lab was doing the CogFlex and CFIS studies back in Miami, University of Miami. And study enrollment included 53 children with autism and 63 typically developing children. And in total, there were 117 participants with roughly even groups across, roughly equal numbers across the 4 groups.
So, Celia, just for the folks who haven't been with the lab a while, can you tell them about like what the questions were in the beginning? Because when we first did this study, we weren't even looking at bilingualism, but you were phone screening them. So Celia was actually the lab manager in the lab at the time when we were, doing some of this imaging work back in Miami, and then she entered the clinical psych grad program with us subsequent to that. But she was the one doing all this data collection back, in Miami. So you were the ones like on the phone with participants and like, talking through, getting them into the study. Can you tell us a little bit about like what you actually asked them and how you determined bilingual status and what you think would be a better way going forward to like, in terms of measurement?
So actually, let me skip to that slide because I think I have it. But mainly here, I just want to mention that we use these 3 as mediators in the analysis that I ran. So here is really what I asked in the phone screening. So just by default, and when we were doing like the participant demographics, we did have this phone screening questionnaire that we asked them a bunch of different questions, whether they were taking medications, whether, they had like just really basic stuff. So all the participants of the study, they did complete a phone screening questionnaire. And this is how we assess bilingual status. Again, in the original study, this was not something I think you guys really thought about, or like a direction we thought we were going to. So as you can see, we're a little bit limited in terms of how we define bilingualism for this project that I did. But first, we asked the parents or guardians what is their child's primary language, right? And then we asked the parents or guardians if their child knows a secondary language. And if so, we asked them to describe the child's proficiency as either not proficient, moderately proficient, and very proficient. Of course, you can think of other potential limitations here because we didn't really provide them any examples of like, well, not proficient in writing or in speaking, So I'm not really sure how these participants interpreted this. So we are quite limited in that. But as you can imagine, in Miami, where Spanglish seems to be the official language, there's a lot of Spanish English speaking families and bilinguals. So for my master's, what I did is that bilingual status, I determined it for participants who indicated that they're moderately proficient or very proficient in their secondary language. So again, a lot of limitations there, but that's really how I did it. And in total, we had 59 bilingual children. And 21 of those children are on the spectrum. 38 of those children are typically developing. So
Oh,
you
so
are
I'm just going to pause. Any questions so far or any? Okay, great.
awesome. And at the end, I also took some screenshots of the measures that you're thinking for the new study moving forward. So we can talk about that and the options, because that's something that I'll discuss. That yes, it's a limitation for my study, but just broadly, the field of bilingualism, there's not one measure to measure bilingualism. It's a very difficult construct to really define. Also monolingualism, right? What does that mean in places like LA and Miami, where people have exposures to so many different languages? So yeah, that's something we can talk about. But in terms of executive function, I used the behavior rating inventory of executive functions, also known as the brief. So it's an 86 item parent report questionnaire, and it assesses executive function among 6 non-overlapping subscales. So that includes inhibit, shift, emotional control, planning and organization, also organization of materials, and monitor. And then all of these are added together in order to obtain the global executive composite score. And really for this study, the shift and inhibit subscales are related to cognitive flexibility. So for my master's, I focused primarily on these subscales based on prior literature suggesting a bilingual advantages in these skills. But we also explored other executive function constructs. So for our first goal, investigating the association between bilingualism and executive functions, we run separate models with each of these subscales as outcomes. And then based on these results we got from these initial models, we then decided what other executive function subscales we wanted to explore in the mediation model that I'll talk about some more. So, yeah.
Those are parent report?
This is parent report, correct. Mm-hmm. So this we collected when we did the second visit. So when they came for the MRI, we, while the child was in the scanner, we gave the parents the Connors, the brief, and a bunch of different measures. So yeah, these are parent report.
And what was it? Mm-hmm. Isn't there a relationship with actual performance?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's kind of mixed. So it seems like these are tapping into more everyday life executive function skills. So like, in everyday life, whereas the lab-based executive function tests are a little bit more limited in that environment, if that makes sense. So studies, typically, it's nice to use a combination of these two and see if they're correlated, but I think the brief does a really nice job at looking at like everyday life executive functions rather than, executive functions in a particular task.
Yeah, in the literature broadly, you'll see sometimes non-convergence between the lab-based task and the parent report, because like real life skills are much harder to do than the task where you're told exactly what to do. So oftentimes like the kids do pretty well on the task. Hey, Bernice. Oftentimes the kids don't have that much problem when you're told exactly what the instructions are and all of that, but then in real life, they have a lot of these troubles with the parents report. So yeah, I guess people like to collect both if they can. So in the study we did back in Miami, we were collecting brief, but then we also had them do the flexible item selection task in the scanner. And then we had them do like the behavioral version of that outside of the scanner. So that was our sort of lab-based task. And then this is our parent report. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'm going to add for this current study is the NIH Toolbox Cognition Battery Test of Executive Function that has like the dimensional change card sort. So we'll have 3 measures in this, which reminds me, I need to buy an iPad and I need to buy that thing, but we're going to be like testing them on the iPad, on the toolbox, then we'll be testing them on the fist and scanner, then we'll be having the parent fill out the brief for so we'll actually get a bigger number of executive function measures that might all tell us something different. So
that's really awesome. I think a lot of the argument also made in these studies that why there's so many mixed findings is, first of all, we're not defining bilingualism the same way, so it's hard to compare among studies, but also executive function, right? Some studies only lab-based, they find this set of results, whereas others that use more brief or like parent questionnaire stuff, tapping more into everyday life things, they might, find something different. So being able to have a combination of both, that's really awesome. Yeah. Unfortunately for this, for the master's that I did, I only really had the brief because a lot of these kids, I was looking more at the behavioral stuff, not the actual CFIS test, because then that would really limit my sample. So I just combined CogFlex, CFIS, and looked at the behavioral stuff that all of them had the same. So the parents and guardians also completed parent report assessments to measure the core autism traits. So the measures included the Children's Empathy Quotient, the EQC, which asked questions about children's ability to take on the perspective of others. We also had the social communication questionnaire, which was used to measure social communication skills and social functioning. And then finally, we also had the repetitive behavior skill, which is a 44-item questionnaire used to obtain a quantitative continuous measure of the full spectrum of repetitive behaviors. So these outcome scores will be considered continuous variables in the mediation model that I'll talk about some more. And again, these are all parent reports. So the first goal is really to understand the relationship between bilingualism and parent-reported executive function abilities in monolingual and bilingual children with autism compared to monolingual and bilingual children or typically developing peers. So here, for this first goal, we studied the linear relationship between diagnosis and bilingual status on the brief, global executive composite scores, as well as the individual clinical subskills of inhibition, shifting, emotional control, initiating, self-monitoring, and all that. So to do this, we created separate linear regression analysis predicting the brief individual subskills from diagnosis and bilingual status. And then we also looked at the interaction between diagnosis and bilingual status. And I should mention again that in these models and subsequent models, we controlled for covariates of age, IQ, and social status. So what we found basically was that the model predicting inhibition scores revealed a significant main effect of diagnosis, whereby parents of children with autism reported significantly more inhibition difficulties as compared to parents of typically developing peers. So given the difficulties with executive function that children on the spectrum often experience, of course, this result is really not surprising at all. We also find that there is no significant main effect of bilingual status, but interestingly, we did find a significant interaction between diagnosis and bilingual status for the inhibit subscale, such that the bilingual effect is stronger for children with autism. So looking at the interaction plot to the left, we can see this protective effect where bilingual children with autism had fewer parent-reported inhibition difficulties as compared to monolingual children with autism. However, we can also see that there's really no difference in inhibition scores between the typically developing children, which is in blue, regardless if they're monolingual or bilingual. And this is kind of confusing. Higher scores is worse. It's more executive function difficulties. So I will move on unless there's any questions.
No, I'd say that's awesome that interaction came out. It looks really nice. Particularly if you don't see the main effect and then the interaction pops out. That's really cool.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Basis of the preliminary data that's gone into all the grants that we've been writing. So this is the basis for the R21 that hopefully is coming in and will allow us to actually do the study we're planning.
Right. And it's cool that we see these things even given the limitations that we have for this pilot data. So yeah, it's cool. Then I ran separate linear regression analysis predicting the brief shift scores from diagnosis of bilingual status. And then we also included the interaction term here. So again, we find a significant main effect of diagnosis, whereby the children with autism received higher parent-reported shift dysfunction scores than typically developing children. And again, this was really no surprise. We also find that there was not a significant main effect of bilingualism. And finally, there also was not a significant interaction between diagnosis and bilingual status for the shift scores. So unfortunately, we didn't find that. But in the plot, we kind of see a trend whereby the monolinguals seem to have more shift difficulties. But again, I do want to mention this has not reached significance. So this might mean that bilingual children with autism did not have significantly less shift difficulties than monolingual children with autism, although we kind of see the trend there. And then we also ran 5 other linear regressions to explore the relationship between bilingualism and the other brief subscales, apart from inhibition and shift. And we did find that emotional control subscale revealed some interesting results. So in the model we ran predicting emotional control scores, we found a significant main effect of diagnosis. So what that means is that there's higher emotional control dysfunction in children with autism as compared to typically developing children. And we also find there was no significant main effect of bilingualism on the emotional control subscale. But what was really interesting is that we do find a significant interaction between diagnosis and bilingual status for the emotional control subscale. So as you can see on the plot, the interaction was really driven by the children with autism, such that bilingual children with autism had fewer parent-reported inhibition and emotional control difficulties than monolingual children with autism. But there was no difference between bilingual and monolingual typically developing children. So rather than a bilingual advantage per se, maybe it's more a bilingual protective effect, where we only see it on children on the spectrum that, you know, they might have these difficulties with executive function. So I know that was a lot. This is just a summary, just a briefly summary, the results from the first set of models. So as expected, we find that children with autism have significantly more executive function difficulties as compared to typically developing children. We also find no significant difference in executive function skills between typically developing bilingual and monolingual children. But we found a significant interaction between diagnosis and bilingual status for inhibition and emotional control skills. Specifically, we found that parents of bilingual children with autism reported significantly less difficulties than monolingual children with autism. So yeah, that was pretty cool. And now I want to move on to the second goal, and feel free to interrupt me. I don't see all of you guys on the screen. And the second goal was essentially to investigate the relationship between bilingualism and core autism traits in children with autism. So specifically, we looked at perspective taking, social communication, and repetitive behaviors as outcomes. So in order to do this, we again created separate multiple linear regressions predicting core autism traits from diagnosis and bilingual status. And similarly to our previous models, we also looked at the interaction between diagnosis and bilingual status. So we included interaction term in our models. And again, we continue to control for covariates of age, IQ, and social status. So our first model predicting perspective taking EQ scores, we find a significant main effect of diagnosis. So again, this is not really surprising because it suggests that children with autism had difficulties or had more difficulties with perspective taking skills as compared to typically developing children. Interestingly, we find a marginally significant main effect of bilingualism on the EQ perspective taking scores, suggesting that bilingual children tend to be slightly better at understanding how other people feel as compared to their monolingual peers. And I do want to mention that this is true for both the autism and the typically developing groups. And we can see this on the plot. But I do want to highlight, it's worth noting that and we did not find a significant interaction between diagnosis and bilingual status. Oh, and I did want to mention, this is a little confusing because now the scale shifts. But here, higher scores on this measure indicate higher levels of empathy or perspective taking skills. So higher scores are better in this case. So now moving on to the model predicting social communication. We find a significant main effect of diagnosis where children with autism struggled more with social communication as compared to typically developing children. But we did not find a significant main effect of bilingual status on the social communication scores. So this basically indicates no difference in social communication skills between monolingual and bilinguals. And I did want to note that we did not find a significant interaction between diagnosis and bilingual status for parent-reported social communication skills as well.
Is
Oh,
that
sorry.
you?
Oh, can you repeat that? Sorry.
Jason was asking, what is social communication? Is that the SCQ score?
SCQ. Yeah, the SCQ score. So this one was the EQ score. The perspective taking was EQ. And then this was the SCQ score.
I mean, like, can there be social communication in their own language or another language? Or is it like social interaction?
Sorry, I can't hear you well. Lucina, can you repeat that?
Want to pull this closer? Hold on one sec. Oh, wait, we're not using that. We're using this. Okay.
Sorry.
Asking.
Oh, the language, which language was the communication happening?
Oh, yeah, which language? Does that matter? Does that, or the questionnaire?
Yeah, that's a great question. This was all done in English. Is that what you're asking? What language this was done in?
Yeah.
Yeah, all these.
In their second language or first language?
Yeah, that would be interesting and another limitation we have. But yeah, unfortunately, we're limited in that all the parent reported measures ask about their social communication. Well, I'm not sure if the measure actually
Specify which,
specifies what language. Actually, it doesn't.
because so SCQ has like nothing to do with bilingualism, so it's just like a forum of questions and then.
One of the two with other kids.
Sure, yeah, so I think like if we wanted to adapt it for that, we'd have to say like, does the kid communicate in Spanish
Because
versus in English?
what's his name? This is a student was looking at this.
Oh, Steve Anderson,
No,
the other guy.
wasn't he showing that you have more emotional connection in one language or the other?
Yeah, that's,
Mhm.
What's his name?
yeah, the
I
other,
know.
Morgan, yeah.
Yeah,
I know, I have this.
yeah, it's something
Sorry.
we have no way of looking at, but I don't. Yeah,
That's what Morgan is doing, right?
yeah, it's something like that, like something better. Forget what he found. Oh, it was pain. He would found like
Of language.
the
or- yeah.
language that you ask the questionnaires and influences the pain ratings or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think Maria Yabre also had a similar study, if I'm not mistaken, also like in terms of language expression and how it differs in English and Spanish when it's like emotional. Yeah, but yeah, unfortunately, yeah, the social communication, the SCQ is just about social communication in general, like the social communication symptoms. But yeah, that's interesting. That's a-
This is not related, but the empathy was. Bilingualism, is that right?
Correct. The empathy in both typically developing and the autism or the children on the spectrum, we do find well, marginally significant between the bilingual and monolingual groups. And that's kind of along with the literature. So a lot of the new literature that's coming out in the bilingual field has to do with theory of mind, which I think is very similar to EQ, perspective taking, and they find or they replicate they suggest the same thing, that in typically developing children and bilingual and children with autism, that bilinguals perform better in theory of mind tests and seem to have these skills more developed, I guess.
I thought it was interesting, it doesn't transfer over to social communication or whatever it is. Because you think if you're better at empathizing, you might be better. Well, I don't know what social communication is.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, even for social communication, you do need perspective taking too, right? Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. But if I'll move on to the next one, if that's okay. Does anyone else have any other questions or thoughts? No? Okay. So finally, for the last model, for our second goal of the study, is a model predicting repetitive behavior scores. So as expected, we again find a significant main effect of diagnosis, implying that parents of children with autism reported more repetitive behaviors in their children as compared to typically developing children. However, no significant differences in repetitive behaviors were found between bilingual and monolingual children. So bilingual children with autism did not have significantly less repetitive behaviors than monolingual children with autism. And there was also no significant interaction. And this was really exploratory. So there's really no other studies that have looked at this, at least that I'm familiar with. So that was a lot. So I want to take some time to just summarize the main findings for the second goal. So first of all, we find that as expected, children with autism had more parent-reported core autism traits as compared to typically developing children. And we find that there's a marginally significant main effect of bilingualism on perspective-taking parent-reported EQ scores. So basically what that suggests is that bilingual children with autism and bilingual typically developing children have an improved perspective taking. And this is in line with emerging research suggesting that bilinguals have enhanced theory of mind or perspective taking skills. And in discussion, I'll talk a little bit more of how I'm interpreting this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So the third and final goal was to test whether enhanced executive abilities in bilingual children with autism indeed underlie improvements in the core autism traits. So we hypothesize that there is an indirect effect of bilingualism on the severity of parent-reported core autism traits via executive function skills. So here in our models, we hypothesize that enhanced executive functions may act as a mediator of the relationship between bilingualism and core autism traits and help explain why bilingualism is related to fewer parent-reported core autism traits. And to test this, we conducted a causal mediation analysis suggested by Barron and Kenny in 4 sets of regressions. And again, for all these mediation models, we continue to include the covariates of age, IQ, and social status. So first, we tested the total effect to examine if bilingualism impacts parent-reported core autism traits. So basically what we previously did for our second goal. Second, we tested the effect of bilingualism on parent-reported executive function skills. So again, this is essentially what I did for the first goal of the study. And then third, we simultaneously tested executive function skills and bilingualism's effect on core autism traits. And finally, we compared the direct and indirect effect. So since I essentially already went over the first 2 steps, I'll only focus on reporting the indirect effect, which will help us understand if there is a mediation, which again is really the purpose of this third and final goal of the study. But as you will see, there is a lot of interesting stuff going on that we can definitely discuss as well. So in total, we ran 9 separate mediation models. For each core autism outcome, we tested 3 mediation models, which included the 2 hypothesized executive functions of inhibition and shifting. But we also looked at emotional control because we found a bilingual difference for that executive function subscale when we ran our models for goal 2. So that was really more exploratory. So for these next 3 models that I will present, we tested whether executive function skills mediate associations between bilingualism and perspective taking skills. And we find that bilingualism, sorry, this is really small. I don't know if you guys can see that, but bilingualism leads to a significant decrease in inhibition difficulties, similar to what we found in our goal 2. And this decrease in inhibition difficulties then leads to an increase in perspective taking skills. So to put that in words, essentially, we find a significant direct and indirect paths to fewer perspective taking skills through inhibition. And we find the same results for shift and emotional control as mediators. So again, as you can see in the models, both the direct and mediated effects of bilingualism on perspective taking skills were significant. And I'm trying to make this a little bit bigger. I don't know if you can see that better. Okay. So I'll move on, and at the end, I'll have a summary and interpretations, and I want to hear from you guys because I'm still making sense of this. So now I'm moving on. I'm going to talk about the models predicting social communication skills. And just like for the perspective taking skills, we ran 3 different models predicting social communication. And essentially, we also find that bilingualism leads to a decrease in inhibition difficulties, as we can see here, which then leads to a decrease in the social communication difficulties. So there was a significant direct and mediated effects for social communication skills through inhibition. And again, we find the same pattern for the models with shift and emotional control as the mediators. So essentially, we find that bilingualism decreases executive function difficulties in these 3 domains, which then in turn decrease social communication difficulties. And finally, we tested whether executive function skills mediate associations between bilingualism and the repetitive behaviors in typically developing children and children with autism. So first, we tested the total effect to examine if bilingualism impacts repetitive behaviors. And overall here, we did not find a significant main effect of bilingualism on repetitive behaviors, and I already talked about this before, but we still explored to see if there's any indirect effects, because recent research has shown that significant mediation effects can be present in the absence of a total effect. And indeed, we did find that bilingualism significantly decreases inhibition difficulties, which in turn decreases repetitive behaviors. So even though we did not find any direct consequences of bilingualism on repetitive behaviors, we find an indirect effect of bilingualism on these repetitive behaviors mediated by inhibition. And we find the same pattern for the other 2 models, looking at shift and emotional control as mediators and the relationship between bilingualism and the repetitive behaviors. So now I have a summary because I know that was a lot. So these are the main findings of the 3rd goal. And then I'll move on to the discussion because I'm mindful of the time. So basically, we find a direct effects of bilingualism on perspective taking and social communication. And this was not found in our previous linear regressions for our 2nd goal. And I think this is most likely the case because our linear regressions for the mediation did not include an interaction term because we looked at these symptoms continuously. And then we also find significant mediation effects of bilingualism on perspective taking, social communication behaviors, social communication and the repetitive behaviors mediated by inhibition, shifting, and emotional control executive functions. And these findings are really exciting because this preliminary study is really the first to our knowledge to assess whether associations between bilingualism and core autism traits are mediated by executive function abilities. So now I want to move on to the discussion, and feel free to interrupt me, and I definitely want to hear your thoughts. So I'll talk about the discussion for each result and possible explanations for the patterns we found. So going back to the results for our 1st goal, we find that bilingualism acts as a protective effect for children with autism on inhibition skills. And this is essentially in line with the joint activation or adaptive control hypothesis that states that a bilingual's experience inhibiting and the competing languages leads to advantages in cognitive control processes. So that kind of makes sense that we would see this bilingual protective effect for inhibition skills. And we also find advantages in the emotional control skills of bilingual children with autism. And this kind of makes sense because inhibitory control involves suppressing one's thoughts, behaviors, or emotions. So inhibition supports effective emotion regulation. So they seem really related. Also, a lot of research has shown that difficulties in inhibitory control occur in children with numerous problems associated with emotional dysregulation. So given inhibition's role in emotional control, this might explain why we find significant interactions between diagnosis and bilingual status for the inhibition and emotional control subscales, but not for the other EF subscales. This is kind of my interpretation. I'm open to hear your thoughts as well. Then in our first goal, although we found that children with autism had impairments on shifting skills, similar to their impairments in inhibition skills, we did not find significant direct effects of bilingualism on the shift scores. And actually, this finding is consistent with some previous studies, suggesting no significant difference in parent-reported shifting abilities across bilingual and monolingual children with autism. But again, the research is really mixed. And there was a recent study that found shifting bilingual advantages in children with autism in the dimensional change card sorting task that Lucina mentioned. So these same researchers, they had the dimensional change card sorting task, and they also had the brief. So they did find differences or significant bilingual advantages in the card changing sorting task. But the same researchers did not find any differences in the brief parent reported shift, just like us. But again, they did find this difference in shifting skills used in more experimental lab-based tasks. So we hypothesize that it is possible that these prior findings of bilingual advantage in shifting tasks in children with autism do not actually extend to ratings of shift in daily life and can only be observed in controlled laboratory settings. So it's really great that for this next project or the study that you guys are going to do, that you're going to be able to collect different types of executive function measures. Another thing is that we know that whereas inhibition quickly develops in early preschool years and shows less change later on, shifting is a little bit different in that it shows a more gradual linear improvement throughout development. So also previous studies have shown that inhibition is needed in order to shift. So it might be possible that the inhibition challenges in children with autism might actually exacerbate shifting difficulties, meaning that bilingualism alone might not be enough to support shifting mechanisms in these children with autism. And we might only see this bilingual advantage in shifting at a later age with accumulated bilingual experience. So that's another possible interpretation. And then in our second and third goal, we find that there is both a direct and indirect association between bilingualism and perspective taking. And this is in line with several other studies that have found bilingual advantages in theory of mind and perspective taking skills in typically developing populations, and then also children with autism. So there's been several explanations set forth as to why bilinguals have a superior perspective taking skills as compared to monolinguals. And really the idea here is that bilinguals have an understanding that they might share either one or both of their languages with others. So in a way, they might have a better understanding that others might also have different states than themselves and different thoughts. So it might be the experience as a bilingual might build perspective taking skills in a very direct way. So that's one possibility. But also bilingualism might build on perspective taking skills indirectly through executive function, because improved executive function skills in bilinguals could efficiently inhibit their own mental states and focus on the mental states of others. So these are just two processes that might explain why we found direct and indirect bilingualism associations for the perspective taking skills in this preliminary study. And sorry, I know this is so much. And then finally, in our third goal, we also find that executive functions mediate the relationship between bilingualism and core autism traits. So the act of being a bilingual learner might increase earlier experiences with inhibition and shifting. And this practice with inhibition and shifting may in turn help bilinguals better communicate, as well as help them more effectively manage their restricted and repetitive symptoms. And we see this across the entire spectrum for both typically developing children and children with autism. So essentially, our study suggests that one potential path to advantages in core autism traits or might be through stronger executive function skills due to the experience of being a bilingual. So that was a lot. And our results need to be interpreted in the context of some very important limitations that I think I briefly touched on, but I want to make it very clear. So again, I think the biggest limitation that we're faced with, at least for this preliminary study, is that we had very limited language exposure and language background information in order to characterize bilingualism in our sample. So a factor that we need to consider is that bilingualism in the study is assessed by parent report. So it is possible that they might underestimate or overestimate their child's bilingual proficiency. Also, as I mentioned before, bilingualism in itself is a very, very, very difficult to define concisely because it involves a number of dimensions. So particularly thinking about language proficiency may be necessary because, of course, someone proficient in both languages has more opportunity of building inhibition and shifting skills. So it would help to rule out other factors. And I'm really excited about this new study that you guys are going to do because you'll have a better idea or more information to inform the decision of how to define bilingualism. Also, I did want to mention the generalizability of the study results should also be interpreted with caution, given, first of all, it's a really small sample, and that our data may represent the experiences of families in Miami, which, as I mentioned before, and I'm sure if you visited, you've noticed, just getting into an Uber, it's a very linguistically diverse city. So given, again, Spanglish, a combination of Spanish and English really seems to be widely used in Miami, it is possible that some executive function demands, particularly inhibition control, might be lower in Miami compared to other cities. So there might be an even stronger differences elsewhere. So it'd be cool to see future studies comparing bilingualism in the context of language minority versus bilingual majority populations to see if maybe the effects are stronger there. Yeah, and then finally, despite these limitations, we can think of some real implications that studies like this might have, and the study that you guys are going to do, because first of all, bilingualism in children with autism is unfortunately very, very understudied. Clinicians often struggle to develop informed recommendations for families with autism. So for this reason, instead of taking into consideration a possible protective benefit of bilingualism on executive function in children with autism, unfortunately, many parents have concerns about raising a child on the spectrum bilingually. And, as we know also, language learning in autism is heavily influenced by parental interaction, and a parent's role would be disrupted if there is a non-native language use with their child. So, for example, when parents use a non-native language to communicate with their children, they have been found to interrupt more often, and use shorter utterances. Also, some studies in autism report that bilingual parents perceive a greater degree of intimacy and comfort and competence when using their native language with their child. And then we can also look at outcomes beyond childhood. Some studies have found that bilingual families, maintaining the parental language, the parental native language, facilitates cross-generational relationships, helps preserve cultural heritage, and also supports like a cohesive family relationship. So really, by limiting the exposure to the parental native language in children with autism, it's possible that we're even adding more additional communication barriers. And I guess, yeah, just to conclude, because there's not a lot of literature currently available to help guide parents when making the decision about bilingualism for their child on the spectrum, the findings of studies like this and like the study that you guys are going to do can really help better inform parents of children with autism regarding the decision. So yeah, for this reason, I think it's really exciting that you guys are going to be able to look into this in more detail and collect more data. And I think that's it in terms of what I had ready for the presentation. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Celia. That was exactly the perfect timing to give us an overview of all these results as we're gearing up to do this study, hopefully on a larger scale. Any questions or comments? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Can you shout a little bit so I can hear you?
Yeah, that's awesome. Congrats on defending you defending your master's and you have that now. Congrats. That's exciting.
Lauren.
I remember we were talking about this back when we were all in Miami, so it's amazing to see all the results. I was just curious if you come across the literature beyond bilingualism, like any additional language exposure, just like, it's very popular for all of like kind of like I think even back when I was a kid, it's like learn some French, like even though the parents aren't like French native speakers. Like I don't know if you came across the literature, if that's something else you might consider in your future work.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm sorry, Lauren, are you asking like
Just language exposure, like learning, like maybe they aren't it's like bilingual to me is like or I'm sure I know you define it, but like they're very comfortable, like 50% split, like right, Spanish, English, but like just any kind of like language exposure. I'll just be curious if you come across that, especially with autism, or if that's something you're looking into.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I guess the studies I've come across with bilingualism, again, it's because every study measures it so differently. So some of them, yes, they do look 50-50. Some of them are like, oh, 20% of proficiency in this language. Oh, you're already bilingual. So yeah, I guess I'm not super familiar.
Tell them about the LEAP-Q, because that's the measure that we'll go for this new study.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that, Lucina?
Yeah, the LEAP-Q. Can you just tell them a little bit about how the LEAP-Q assesses bilingualism?
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to share my screen again, and this is just it's de-identified, but this is just an example of a completed LEAP-Q. So the LEAP-Q is a way to assess or get information that is related to bilingualism. So Lauren, if you're interested in that question, the LEAP-Q that you guys are going to collect is awesome because you see the different percentages. And then based on that, you really see, so here, let me make it bigger so we can read it. So first you ask about the language background. So in order of dominance, order of acquisition, when they started hearing the language. So kind of what you were saying, Lauren, like that language exposure. So they list when they started producing single words, 2-word phrases, complete sentences, and they would do that for both languages. I mean, if they have even a third language, let's say French, then they would add it here as well. So that's pretty cool because you can also look at not only bilinguals, but also multilinguals. Then here they asked, please list what percentage of time your child currently on average actively speaks or passively hears. So that's also interesting to be able to separate that. Then they ask about, school exposure, because a lot of schools have, even though they're not bilinguals, they might have exposure at school of a second language because they're taking a class. So you ask about that. And then what I really like about the LEAP-Q, let me see, what is this? The percentage currently on average that they speak each language at school. So more specific to school, this was more specific to home. And then the home environment. So, you know, who is at the home? What language do they speak? So that can give you some information. So please list all the languages your child hears at home. So it gives you some information about the home environment. And I really like this page because it kind of gets to what you were mentioning, Lauren. So it talks about proficiency. So that's important to know. It talks about how they understand the spoken language, whether it's reading, but then also how much of the following factors contributed to them learning that language. And this is the part that I think has to do with what you were saying, Lauren, is to what extent your child is currently exposed to the language in the following context. So this is cool because here it's like, you know, how much do the following factors actually contribute to them learning it, but also what exposure do they have in those languages, right? So they have like interacting with friends, family, caregiver, teachers, listening to music, right? Maybe they like reggaeton, I don't know, watching TV, they watch telenovelas, reading, additional language lessons, things like that. And then here, I only showed the English, but in the LeapQ, for all the languages that they state or like they identify, then you would have, you know, these 2 pages for English and these 2 pages for Spanish as well. So you can get an understanding of like where they're learning both languages. For a lot of kids, at least in Miami, they get a lot of Spanish exposure at home. And then in school is really where they learn the English. So it might differ. So it's really cool because the LeapQ does provide you with a lot of rich information. But with that said, there's also some caveats to that because with so much information, how are you going to decide how to define it, right? So pros and cons, but I think the LeapQ is really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, this is included in the IRB to collect here, so we'll get all kinds of information. The question is then how do we use it? But it's also interesting, we're focusing a lot on Spanish-English bilingualism because that's the most common one in Miami and in LA. But is it the case that the literature suggests similar benefits like for French English and, you know, Mandarin English and all the other types that have been studied? Are there kind of similar findings across these different domains of language?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, even in English and Spanish, the literature is very mixed, whether there is an advantage or not. But a lot of the studies that I've seen come from Canada or like Quebec, Montreal, that, you know, they do speak English and French. There a lot of bilinguals for those 2 languages. And again, similar pattern where there's a lot of mixed results. So I'm not really sure how to answer that question, but I guess it makes sense. I would be interesting to like learn about different studies that might use languages such as like maybe English and Mandarin, where there's a lot of other differences in even like the alphabet and things like that. But at least for English and French, we do see the same patterns, where some studies do report a bilingual advantage per se, while others don't find any differences. Sorry, that doesn't answer your question, but
Wide open field, so I'm glad we're getting into it.
yeah.
Celia, you said you did, you have your review paper on it. Did you by chance break down the studies, like group them by like how much they report, like like if it was like 20% versus 50%, like did you break it down to see if there were like more conclusive results once you like separate, or like do people just don't report it very well?
That's the problem. Well, just to answer your question, for the review, no, I did not do that, but that's an excellent idea. And it is tricky because papers are not consistent in their reporting of how they really separate their groups. So some of them look at bilinguals based on like age of acquisition, also the proficiency, and or like percentage of exposure, spoken language. So yeah, but that's a good question, like looking at it that way. At least for this study, when I was thinking about how to define bilingualism, at first I was just separating. Remember, I asked them, like, are you bilingual? Like, do they know a second language? If so, describe the proficiency. And they had 3 options. It was not proficient, moderately proficient, and very proficient. So looking at, what was it? These results look at moderately proficient and very proficient. But when I ran it with moderately proficient, or sorry, when I ran like just bilingualism, including those that are not proficient as well, I did not see these effects. Because again, these not proficient bilinguals are still bilinguals, right? They said, yes, they know a second language, they're just not proficient. Of course, we're really limited because I have no idea what they mean by that. Like, does it mean that, oh, they can listen, like they can understand, but they can't speak back, or they can't write, or, you know, it'd be nice to have more information, but at least in this study, like exploratory, when I was grouping them, you might need to have like, or be more bilingual, I guess, if that makes sense, in order to see these effects.
So yeah, when we were doing the previous study, we were interested, of course, in comparing children with autism to typically developing kids, and that was the focus of that study. But for the new grant, we basically, we saw that the typically developing kids don't differ that much, you know, whether they're monolingual or bilingual in terms of executive function. So we sort of like have dropped the TD kids for this current study. So we're only going to look at kids who are diagnosed with autism, and then we're going to use this LEAP-Q to like fully characterize the degree of bilingualism. So we'll just basically over the next 2 years, we'll be scanning 100 kids who are diagnosed with autism and just assessing their level of bilingualism. So the only question is like, how much does bilingualism and degree of it impact executive function in kids who are diagnosed? So it's going to be really specific. And we have, you know, the 3 measures of executive function. We have a good measure of bilingualism. We'll get the brain imaging, as you guys know. So this is going to be really targeted and the first study of its kind. I don't know any published studies on bilingualism and autism in kids between 9 and 12. So Celia, this is a great example of taking an idea and, you know, making it a whole new project that the lab was not going to be working on, but now it's all we're working on. So thanks for introducing this really interesting line of work to all of us.
Yeah, no, and I mean, thank you for the opportunity to, you know, thank you for even giving me this opportunity, right? Because I mentioned this before, a lot of labs are like, this is what we do, this is all we do. But you really allow your students to explore further and like pursue their specific interests. So thank you.
Well, this is great. Any other questions while we still have Celia on the line? I know it's late over there, so I'll let you guys pop off, but yeah. Can you talk loud? Because I don't know if she can hear it.
Celia, this was amazing work, and I feel like there are large implications about impact and policy that we can draw from this. Are there any that that you would like to share, like about policies, like for instance, you know, whether families should be discouraged or encouraged to have their children, especially those with on the autism spectrum, learn multiple languages?
Yeah, Katie, is that you?
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, it's nice to meet you finally. Yeah, no, and I know you're also clinical, so I'd love to hear your thoughts too. But I, you know, really when I came up, or when I thought of this idea, I was working as an ABA therapist, like part-time. And I was really surprised when I learned that a lot of bilingual families in Miami, which most families in Miami are bilingual or they're immigrants, they're recommended to, you know, only teach your child one language. So what that happens is typically these families feel like, okay, well, you know, English would be that one language, right? Despite them only being Spanish speakers or learning English as a second language. So, I mean, I just think of so many implications about, right, how is the quality of that language that you're providing your child once they receive the diagnosis, right? It's probably not the best quality if English is not your first language, or if you can barely speak it, but you receive this recommendation of like only stick to one language. So there's a lot of implications there. We have a similar, I don't know what it's called in UCLA, but we have the CARD Center. I think it's also called CARD, right? Yeah, the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. So they're in Miami. It seems like they recommend, like they just tell the family that whatever they decide is fine, and they do support like a bilingual environment for these children. But a lot of pediatricians to this day, at least in Miami, they still give these recommendations of like stick to one language, which is kind of crazy given how diverse the United States is and how many immigrants there are and the implications that can have, right? You're just, yeah, I don't know. So I'm not arguing that there is an advantage per se like that. I feel like we don't know. But I think it's just important that there's research out there saying like, look, regardless if there's an advantage or not, if there's a protective effect or not, it's not detrimental, right? So the fact that we're providing these recommendations without actual research backing it, especially these recommendations that just have so many implications, right, for the families, it's wild to me. So I hope, you know, there'll be more research and just, you know, doesn't matter if there's an advantage or not, but it's not bad, go ahead. So yeah. And I would love to hear in UCLA or in LA, because I know that's also very linguistically diverse city, if you know about the recommendations for children with autism.
I mean, I just know from CHART that they don't even have Spanish English bilingual clinicians. So surprisingly, you know, in a city with such a high Spanish speaking population. So but yeah, I mean, I think the recommendations are pretty vague, right? Because there's not a whole lot of research to, I mean, now it seems like the research is suggesting there's no negative effects of bilingualism, but I think for a long time, the clinicians had gone with the assumption that if you have a child with language delay, you should only try to expose them to one language, so as to not make it any worse. But I think that even that recommendation is now outdated, right? So.
Mhm. Yeah, there was a qualitative study that came out recently that it was qualitative interview, so it was a small sample, but it was showing how for a lot of families, once they receive this diagnosis of autism, they just either they completely stop speaking the second language or they decrease their interactions in that second language with their child. So I mean, even if there's not that explicit recommendation, where it seems like it still is in some cases or some centers or some cities, families themselves still have this preconceived notion that it might be harmful or make it even more challenging. So yeah, I think it's like really exciting that you guys are going towards this direction, especially in LA.
Yeah, thanks for this great review for all of us, because it was helpful to review the literature together before we, you know, jump into the study. We actually are just about to go down to the scanner and do a pilot and start the filming. So we will let you all go on Zoom. And thanks so much, Celia, for joining us, and for the rest of you for joining so late in the East Coast. We'll see you all next time, and we'll show you the final video once we get the all that wrapped up. And, I think you guys already did an interview, right, with Celia? Okay, great. So we're all set for that. And thanks so much again. We'll be in touch.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna put my email. Feel free to, if you guys have any other questions or want to talk some more, feel free to reach out. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Celia. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
So I just got a text from Adriana. She said she should be here by 5, which is great because we can start. Do you want to debrief us a little bit? I think